right, good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Find the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcast. As I mumble my name today. Anyways, how you doing, folks? Continuing on the police reform front on this one, focusing on not talking specifically about defunding the police specifically, but more so the support about defunding the police and how it is talked about specifically. Again, the slogan is engaged and talked about. This happens the most, particularly in our national media, but we see it on Twitter, Facebook. And I'm sure your friends have had this conversation, particularly or specifically around the idea why defund is a bad slogan. Anyways, it's a widely ran away narrative on all of this. Why defunding the police isn't, a good idea as far as a slogan. I should say, as far as if you're interested on learning a bit more about defunding the police, it's a past episode that I did called Why Defunding the Police Isn't Scary. It's a good episode. It really digs behind the broad ideology within the spectrum, as it is an ideological spectrum within it. Just like there was with abolition, there were colonialist abolitionists that wanted abolitionists. There were segregationists that were abolitionists. It's a very diverse spectrum, and indeed, some people that advocate defund are abolitionists. Others aren't, but it's a spectrum. It's not just some are for abolition. Like it's broad, just like anything in this country, particularly within Black America. There's an ideological spectrum. And range of what it is. But there's a core aspect to what defund actually is. I'll hit that here in a second. But more broadly, it's really a call to reimagine what public safety looks like, to think of it beyond the juvenile cops and robbers mentality most people hear and hold. It's to think beyond law enforcement and state-sanctioned violence as a solution to public safety. Some call it reimagining public safety, but in a non-political sense, as that has been co-opted in a real way by politicians. But it's there. We are actually having the wrong argument and wrong conversation around defund. Folks are perpetually engaging in the conversation about the slogan of what people want, what they don't want, who's called for it, etc. It goes on, as we know. But we're not getting to the meat of it. Of why there was a call, what it could look like, the problems with law enforcement, and indeed also our justice system. So instead of getting the meat, they really, dismiss it. And these are some of the very same people, most of them at least, that have made the claim we should understand Trump voters, that we're alienating Trump voters, that we need to listen to them, and their concerns about America because they feel unheard. And then these same people won't give the same grace to those calling for defund. It's dismissed. They're dismissed. They don't attempt to create the same space to engage in who's making the call, the why, the ideas behind it. The same thing is happening with critical race theory. We have to understand and see these differences and, who are these demographics? There isn't a conversation about why people feel unheard, disenfranchised, and why they are making the call as such. There's no real attempt to understand Black America, let alone activist Black America. There are a million of articles in the New York Times, particularly the New York Times, and reporters going to cafes in rural white America, let alone ignoring rural Black America or rural brown America or indigenous populations and indigenous nations that might be living in rural areas, but the only rural people are rural white Americans, and the only ones listening to about their concerns and disenfranchisement are white Americans. Black Americans, brown Americans, indigenous nations are dismissed in this sense, particularly their individuality, and this ideological spectrum is dismissed. Because we don't see reporters going to bodegas in New York, or corner stores, or bodegas in Chicago or elsewhere, or going to Black restaurants, right? Listening and talking to a random Black person about these things and writing the same article a million times over about these folks. Or talking about, it's what's going on, our op-eds and talking heads, folks talking about why the slogan is wrong and why it is bad and the issues people have with the slogan, again, centering white America. The criticism is the exact same of these activists that these same very smart people have had for a long time, regardless of what the slogan was, because it's not actually about the slogan. It's the issues at hand. They don't want to actually have the real conversation, the meat of the conversation, the underlying arguments, or the role police in society and what public safety actually is. This role also doesn't get confronted enough with reform. Reform accepts the assumption that currently how law enforcement is set up indeed makes us safer. It's about a fiddling and adjusting. It accepts the framing that our current law enforcement system is necessary, and that it's not institutional or structural issues per se, but somehow the structures can be remodeled. Defund rejects this and adjusts it and changes it. So now the next problem is that this discourse on defunding is people turning to public opinion polls to say, see, people don't even want to defund. And there are three big issues with this. First, so if you ask the question about defunding, yes, it isn't broadly popular. But if you ask deeper questions about law enforcement, their role in society, and specific policies that fall under defund in certain framing, well, the picture becomes a little bit different. Now let's put a pin in this. Specifically, I'm going to come back around to it. Now, secondly, this tends to be an argument used by white men to dismiss activists. It's a tool to use black voices to silence other black voices, right? Black moderates, conservatives, white moderates, white folks love to do this. They do actually do this a lot with MLK, right? They will use select quotes from MLK or other black people to dismiss the concerns of black people. Turning black people against black people. So, well, this black person disagrees with you, so that means you must be wrong and I must be right because this black person agrees with me. Is quite racist in real ways, and wrong, and oftentimes, again, pull one MLK quote, the one they know, we know which one it is, to try and do this while ignoring everything else about King, about all of this, and state violence, and that's a whole nother thing. But again, like the slogan, they're not intellectually engaging with the ideas or topics at hand. They're not intellectually engaging when they focus on the slogan and not the deeper structural issues. When they see the poll or so-and-so percentage don't support defunding the police, I'm getting distracted, I'll get to it. The third intersects quite a bit with the second. They claim that the defund call is something from so-called academic elites. I've seen woke elites, and the implication is ivory tower, white professors and white intellectuals and white leftists at universities that have created this idea, have created this policy, and that it isn't something that arose naturally out of black activists. Again, they're whitewashing the history as a way to delegitimize it and to say that it is an elite call and say it's not a really grassroots call. One, it creates a ideology of black hegemony, of basically, it erases ideological diversity among black Americans, particularly because black Americans generally vote for one party. It's a whole thing, and again, most of these folks don't know any actual black people, or at least not many. They might have 1-2 black friends at most. So on one hand, black folks aren't smart enough to create such an idea, as it has to have been something pushed by the ivory tower white leftist academics who they claim, the very smart people, are out of touch with the world. Well, simultaneously, they will call it intellectually shallow, that doesn't have any real thought behind it. There's no real policies to defund. They're like, what is it? It always changes. And again, they're not engaging in good faith. They refuse to engage in the writings, intellectual thought process, the policies of what it actually is, where it arose and where it really arose. And then they come back and, well, it's still a bad slogan. People don't want it, and police are good anyways. It's intellectual malpractice. And again, as last week's episode, it's effectually manufacturing consent when we see this from the media perspective. Okay, so we're going to wrap back around to point one, the public opinion polling, and why this is tricky. So let's dig into these public opinion polls, what they say, and why. Well, I'm not going to get too caught up in the data. It's kind of boring. But we're going to highlight some things. Vox did actually a couple of great articles on this, but there's been some stuff written in NPR, Washington Post, New York Times, and other folks have done some stuff on this. But I think Vox did it best in really digging through the complexity of this, specifically in highlighting the problems with polling. First, Black people are not a monolith. Like everyone, we hold a multitude of views, opinions, as a group and individually. Some seemingly contradict one another, and sometimes they actually do. As anybody, humans are not rational. So, for example, Vox reported a June 2020 Yahoo News YouGov survey taken after the killing of George Floyd found that 50% of Black respondents still said that we need more cops on the street, even as 49% of Black respondents said they personally see police officers. They personally see a police officer. It makes them feel less secure. It can conflicting opinions. And some of this we know as police literally underserve and over-police Black communities at the same time. We can see this in clearance rates, particularly on murders and as well as response rates, where there's times where a call would be hours of response, saying the south side of Chicago around so-called criminal activity, a shooting or whatever. And somewhere else in a white affluent neighborhood, it's minutes, and a lot of times for some BS. As well as clearance rates, we can see a difference. In murders and violent crimes, police love to blame it on no snitch culture when that's a whole, maybe another time. That's a whole thing. But that very same poll, again quoting Vox, in the reporting on this, found that most Black Americans said they were more worried about police brutality against minorities than about local crime, and thought that the Minneapolis City Council's pledge to dismantle their police was a good idea. They also favored gradually redirecting police funding toward increasing the number of social workers, drug counselors, and mental health experts responsible for responding to nonviolent emergencies. That sounds like defund to me. The Policing Portals Project dug into a multitude of views, especially those most impacted by police. As many have noted, views change depending upon class status. Participants characterize police as contradictory everywhere when surveilling people's everyday activity, and nowhere if called upon to respond to serious harm. Locals also report that their experience of government bears little resemblance to official governance or written law. Again, this idea that police aren't legitimate in a lot of real ways. So what people want, really where this idea of more police comes in, and we start digging into what it is they feel their communities are not safe. And wanting to invest in other things, still have this due to this views that somehow police can create. It's a look for safety when you look at it, I guess, in encompassing it all. Particularly in some of the contradictory views of police, while making them feel unsafe. They want more police. So what is that really about? It's about making the community feel safe, while not necessarily knowing all the ways that it could. So again, reframing what public safety is very important in this conversation. The Prison Policy Institute has further information on this complexity. This is a survey of Philadelphia of about 1,300 respondents. 75% felt that police are bad at preventing violence. This is true. 58% of those who said that they had to call police in the year found them unhelpful. 10% said very unhelpful. So total of 68% found them unhelpful to very helpful. 96% said they support reallocating funds to support affordable housing, mental health services, and public schools, and community colleges, as well as community violence prevention programs, drug treatment, and youth recreational programs were also frequent choices on this. Again, that's, defund. The Alliance for Safety and Justice also did a Towards Shared Safety, the first ever national survey of American safety gaps. And they say it is a first of its kind national study of Americans' unmet safety needs and public safety policy preferences. It was a survey of over 4,000 Americans about their experiences with safety and attitudes about safety policy. In particular, the survey engaged with people vulnerable to the cycle of crime, including crime victims, people experiencing mental health or substance abuse challenges, and those living with past convictions, as well as voters of all backgrounds, regardless of experience. We'll highlight through it. I suggest reading through the survey. It's very, very interesting. I'll quickly run through some of the findings. Overall, it found broad consensus exists at the neighborhood level across different demographics. Public safety policies and investments should prioritize violence prevention, recovery, mental health, re-entry, and the most effective strategies to stop the cycle of crime more than incarceration. Incarceration is not an effective strategy, and neither is police. We know this. I've covered this multiple times. The support cuts across demographic groups, with majority across party lines supporting most of the shared safety solutions, and they had a lot of safety solutions. So when presented with these solutions, opposed to investing in police or continue to invest in police, they wanted to invest in these solutions. People want solutions. Police are not solutions. I'll continue. Some other key highlights. Crime victims lack recovery support. We do nothing to support crime victims. Voters say don't prioritize prisons and jails in the context of growing budget deficits. State and local governments will face trade-offs in determining from really where to trim in this. Voters prefer protecting nearly every other aspect of government over prisons and jails. When asked which areas of government spending should be protected from cuts, nearly all voters surveyed, 98%, do not want prisons and jails protected from cuts. By compared, 4 out of 10 voters prefer protecting healthcare and public services from spending cuts. Voters say prioritize prevention, mental health, and reentry, specifically as it relates to investments made to advance public safety. We have better reentry services, means a safer public, because we better support those reentering our society. This is even beyond like an abolition argument here around prisons. Voters say that the most important public safety programs to fund are mental health and crisis response treatment, job training and placement programs for people released from prison, community-based violence prevention programs. Voters also support, again, local public safety reforms to better address crime. They support local efforts to shift responses to crime at the community level before people enter prisons or jails. Nearly 8 out of 10 voters support expanding the 911 system so that calls for mental health and substance abuse issues are directed towards trained mental health professionals responding instead of police. Nearly 6 in 10 voters support shifting local funds from police to community organizations that use relevant experts to address issues such as domestic violence, de-escalation, mental health, and violence interruption programs. All of these things are also more effective, I've covered this multiple times over, than police at actually preventing and interrupting all these things. All these things. The ACLU just did a poll at Brooklyn Center. The new ACLU Change Research poll shows overwhelming support for re-examining public safety in Brooklyn Center and investing in alternative public safety mechanisms and structures. All right, so Vox did some great reporting on this. A lot of this on really how you ask the questions. If you ask straight up to defund, less support. You change how you ask. It differs. This article is called "Do Americans Support Defunding Police?" It depends how you ask the question. By Anna North. Again, this is at Vox. They go into a lot of detail. I suggest you read it. So with this, they looked at a Perry Undum research, asked questions a little bit differently than do you support defund, do you not support defund. They asked right now, really, the survey read, taxpayer dollars for police departments go to all kinds of things police officers are responsible for. from writing up traffic accident reports for insurance companies to resolving disputes between neighbors to investigating murders. Respondents were then asked if they supported having more of those tax dollars and the responsibility that goes along with them directed elsewhere. Instead, most said yes. In addition, to the 72% who said they supported redirecting money from police departments to pay for mental health experts, 70% said they would support having taxpayer dollars reallocated to pay for healthcare professionals to go to a medical emergency instead of armed police officers. And 66% said they supported reallocating funds to pay for a social worker to respond to a call about a homeless person who is loitering instead of an armed police officer. The poll asked Americans if they would support the option short of full defunding, in which police could focus on crimes like burglary and murder, and other service providers could focus on emergency calls about addiction, mental health, illness, and homelessness. A full 61% responded supported this option, and just 16% opposed it. That it really sure sounds like people support what defund actually really is. The article goes much deeper into it. I suggest you read it again. It's called, again, Do Americans Support Defunding Police? Depends on how you ask the question, by Anna North, again. So it explores many different surveys and demographics on how and why you ask these questions and why they're important. And this is why a lot of folks, misunderstand polling. How you ask the questions is very, very important. How you frame the questions is very, very important. You can make a poll and ask questions in a certain way to basically rig it, to get what you want it to say. You might not, and there's ways that you might not intentionally rig it, but if you're not careful, you're still going to skew the answers in a certain way, depending on how you frame it. And even then, it also doesn't necessarily mean that if the public supports something, it's good or it's bad. There's a multitude of complexion here. Again, remember, MLK was the most hated man at the time of his death in America. In fact, most black Americans didn't even like him. The civil rights movement was highly unpopular as well and said it was moving too fast. So you can't really get too caught up in all of that, but it's still important to understand what people support, what they don't support, but also how you ask the questions and how that changes what people actually support. A lot of these folks saying people don't support defund ignore all this other stuff here that looks at how and you ask the questions, shift how people respond to. So it's not that clear cut. So really, and again, this is all a distraction because people say, well, it's a bad slogan, people don't support it. So don't get caught up in the slogan argument. And even though I just spent a lot of time on what the polls mean, I'm just really it's about providing context because I'm not arguing with anybody individually. If I was in an individual conversation, it would be about reframing the argument. And ignoring these polls, I might throw a little bit in there and saying that they're biased, but it doesn't get to the meat of the subject. It doesn't get to the structural issues at hand. Always bringing it back around to what the debate should be about. Reframe the conversation around what actually is going on and what actually needs to happen. Now, all that said, the left in its multicultural and multi-ideological entirety, and I'm including moderates here, and they really are the worst of the bunch in this, need to get their collective act together when it comes to framing messaging and marketing. Black activists might actually be the least problematic around messaging and marketing in this bunch, in some interesting cultural ways, partly because America both hates and loves black people and loves black culture. There's a whole thing there. But moderates are perhaps the worst, basically because they accept the right-wing framing of almost everything in its entirety. So then they engage, in these debates, already capitulating the large part of the argument, which is framing. And once you accept your opponent's framing of an argument, you've effectively lost already. And part of this debate is particularly moderates and white moderates and left to center folks accepting the right and conservative framing around public safety, law enforcement, and policing. That's part of this, is they accept it. And we will always lose the messaging war if we accept that. The only way to do this is to reframe it all. Defund actually helps with this. It helps reframe it because it rejects the right framing, the right's framing. And while I think there is perhaps better messaging around the ideas that could be created, I'm not entirely sure what is better. doesn't quite cut it. Reform or reallocation are laughable on a multitude of levels. But if anyone ever says defund is a bad slogan, ask back, bring it back around why they don't support defund. Bring the meat of the conversation to the forefront. Serve the main dish. Don't engage with them on if it's a good or bad slogan. Engage with them on the fact police don't prevent the social ills they're asked to respond to. Make it about public safety and what public safety should look and feel like. Reframe the public safety conversation. That's what has to happen, and that's why defund is important, because it helps reframe it. Don't give up ground on the reframing. Don't say, well, you have a point on this, that, or the third. Because most of the data doesn't even back a lot of this stuff up. There is a conversation to be had, what might be a better slogan to get people to accept this framing. But these moderates and left of center folks aren't actually having that conversation because they're just using the slogan issues as a way to dismiss the entirety of the argument. They're being intellectually dishonest and shallow and just down the line. They're not engaging in good faith. So always bring it back around to that framing. And amongst each other, those that are actually engaged in this, work together maybe to find a better slogan. The real folks, you know what I'm saying? But that can be done behind the scenes and in the right spaces and time. But on Facebook and with folks that are engaging in bad faith and all that, those aren't the people. That isn't the space. You know who it is. You know who it is. That is it for this week here at Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brungen, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. Thanks for coming, and have yourselves a good week. Have a good one, folks.
This is 365 Media.